We are now ascending into the magnificent heights of awareness and conscious states, or states of consciousness. So these domains, these higher planes that we're now going to explore, are known as the Brahma Devas, or rather the Brahmalokas, where these particular devas reside. And the spirit here is exceptionally polished. It is supra-subtle, and it is refined. It's distinctly separate from the worldly heavens. These regions are known as the Brahma spheres, not to be mistaken for the Brahma Viharas, because those are meditations on kindness and serenity and compassion and things like that. So these are specifically the lokas, the realms, and I'll explain some of their characteristics here. So you first must realize that this is a completely unique level of existence, because the beings that we mentioned earlier, the gods in the sensual heavens, are in fact much more similar and related to our own psychology, the human world, than the Brahmas. So the demigods and the gods are much more similar, closer to our world than the Brahmas. The Brahmas the Brahmans are very high and highly advanced beings. And so this is a fresh dimension of life. Another term is a rupa plane. Rupa plane. I just said you don't want to. I think there is something called arupa, so I don't want my to get mistaken for an a in the word. But we call it that plane of form to contrast it with the formless level of pure mentality, a pure mentalness. So these Brahmas possess physical shapes. Actually, they do have some form. In the English texts, we sometimes label this the fine material plane. It's even more subtle. But that phrasing is a bit imprecise because it highlights that they have physiques, they have bodies. Really, though, their bodies are just, it's stated that they're simply much more delicate than our own. And they consist of a special type of substance. These forms are so light that they remain hidden even from the lower gods. So the gods themselves can't even perceive the Brahmas. The Brahma must intentionally project a heavy or a more denser form to be seen by anyone. And they can decide to show themselves to other gods in that way. They usually are completely imperceptible, though, even to those divine beings. So they live within a fairly intricate... so they live in a fairly intricate social order. We can simplify this by saying that there are 4 levels that correspond with the 4 jhanas. So their standard way of thinking is identical to being in a jhana. They function in these jhanic worlds. It functions as a type of prolonged bliss. That's how it's experienced. And that's just how their world goes around. That's how they think. It's the state of mind. It's the overall vibration of these planes. And so the prolonged bliss is the rapture of the first jhana. People might mistake jhana for a numb or frozen condition where there's no emotion, but the like a very neutral, just an empty state. But the first three jhanas are actually they contain a high degree of delight. They have that rapture, that bliss. It's a very excited or excitable feeling. It has movement to it. It's stimulating. It's joyous. So it's not until the fourth jhana where that equanimity is fully developed and there's that balance, that final refined version of bliss. That's where things become a little bit more empty. There is just the vibrations of these emotions become more still at this level. Whereas before that, the first few jhanas, they have motion to them. And it's described in the suttas in a couple different ways. So in the Samadhi, you're existing at an extremely elevated state. And the durations of life in this territory are incredibly vast. These lifespans exceed the length of an entire cosmic cycle from the second level of the second jhana and above. They live on a very high plateau where it's like living on a very high plateau where you can view all the other previous or lower dimensions. They're just all before you. It's like standing on a mountaintop or at a penthouse and seeing down the city. You can see everything because you have the highest perspective or the near highest perspective. All the preceding levels are accessible and perceptible. So they watch the human and divine systems beneath them. And a Brahma might see thousands of these worlds like a traveler just viewing pebbles on a path. And I emphasize this point because when people are instructed in shamatha meditation, it's not a cramped or overly focused mindset. It's supposed to be an expansive awareness, like a wide ocean of thought, where a Brahma encompasses thousands of solar systems. So this vision is more like a panorama perspective than than like a zoom lens. It's not a narrow beam of focus. It's a cosmic vista, and it's a great awareness. So this state resembles, the sight of being able to see massive star clusters drifting like sand in the air. And it's a useful perspective. It's very useful and powerful because it warns you against the wrong path. You can see things very prudently from a distance. You're not hyper-focused on some detail and missing the bigger picture or missing the greater purpose. If you see a tiny pointed focus, you're searching for a detail, your motive will change and it will be very erroneous and too specific. So these depictions of the Brahma world assist us with the concept of Samadhi and of the jhanas in practice. the descriptions themselves help trigger a feeling of universal relaxation, because it's better to be guided into it through words than to try to sit in a cold room and struggle for hours trying to get into these states after reading about it. So the advice is for the students who are watching, those who wish to master jhana might actually gain a lot by studying the Brahma domains, because these realms are described as the natural harvest or a result of practicing jhana. It's and another important detail is that when you enter the first level, this means you're moving past the sensory world. And this is the core essence of the Brahmas themselves. They become more detached from our common sensory habits as you move upward. So this separation begins even at the very first stage. They don't have any separation into different genders either. They don't have male or female identities. And biologically, if you will, or how they exist, at least, they don't have distinct genders at this point. So every inhabitant is viewed simply as just a conscious being. So that's how they're built, but it's also how they identify. They don't need gender. They don't identify with it. They don't have biological sexuality. And they don't eat food either. They certainly don't eat the way that we do. Even the lower gods, they eat food. It's just a very sophisticated type of divine meal. But the Brahmas sustain themselves purely on internal ecstasy. They just sustain themselves on bliss. And they find their fuel in joy. And you would think that maybe it's just bothersome to manage the intake of food all the time, because when you're really consumed by a task, some kind of or activity, then it's easy to forget about your hunger or to neglect it because you're just so into something. So I would imagine that it's also, and for us, food is a physical indulgence and a necessity. But on the other side, there's also the inconvenience of having to process waste. So, you wouldn't want to be distracted by such things during millions of years of rapture. Now the title of Brahma, or the term Brahmaloka, wasn't a new invention of the Buddha. He didn't coin the word himself. But he did provide a very fresh definition for the concept. So the term originates from a Sanskrit foundation, and that root connects to the idea of growing or expanding. It shares a base with words meaning to develop or to become. And in traditional non-Buddhist settings where there's a split between the neutral Brahman and the masculine Brahma, Brahman was viewed as a universal law. It's kind of a functional word, I guess, like Brahmanic, rather than a particular Brahma person. And then Brahma is that's the entity, a Brahma. So it's the expression of that. And we can, and like the living expression, I should say, we can still find a hint of that history in the Pali grammar. While the word Brahma is technically a masculine noun, it sometimes uses neutral endings. So this creates some ambiguity regarding its specific gender. The tradition was actually quite modern in its refusal to label the divine as male or female. So it predates the current religious shift toward a more inclusive view of a supreme power. In the earlier Vedic or Upanishadic eras, this figure acted as a very high deity. It occupied a space similar to the concept of a creator god in other faiths, like Hinduism, where the ultimate god is Brahma. And I believe he's singular too. But this specific entity doesn't actually show up in the oldest Vedas. It makes its debut later in the Upanishads. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly when it became the primary god. That status probably existed before the Buddha's time. We see records in Buddhist texts where outsiders describe Brahma as the ultimate creator. So we should examine how the Buddha flipped the universal hierarchy regarding this figure. Because Brahma assumes he's the supreme creator of all things. And then in the story, the Buddha disagrees with that assessment. And this provides a very fascinating explanation for how the belief in the singular God begins. You know, a new universe starts a cycle of growth and decay. And what happens is a great Brahma eventually appears completely by itself, of himself. And this happens at the first level of jhana. And he's the very first resident of that specific palace. And after an enormous span of time, other entities manifest through their own past actions. And these become the subordinate for his court. So this Brahma develops the conviction that they earned, or that he earned their companionship. He believed that it was his own desire of not being alone, wanting more beings in the universe, that brought them into existence. And these followers also accept this claim when he announces it. So everyone's convinced. And they offer him adoration. They adore him. They worship him as a result. So his circle of subordinates, gods, and other lesser Brahmas, this grows and accumulates as they continue to worship him, and he stands as the ultimate authority on that specific dimension. But he then observes Earth and the inferior layers beneath his station, and he talks to himself into the idea that he also created those planes as well. So everything. So he visits himself, he views himself as the master of the universe, the entire universe. And eventually the lifespan of a lesser Brahma or God concludes, and they perish from that realm, and they take birth again on the human plane. And if they pursue the life of a monk, they may experience flashes of their former life. They categorize these memories as glimpses of paradise and prime creator. And this actually has turned into a doctrine in itself that has spread around parts of Asia. It teaches that there's a supreme Brahma God who fashioned every living thing in existence. everything in the universe. But this is just a foundation, or rather a fundamental error of recollection. It's an honest mistake. It's not a intentional trick. It's easy to believe that as a reincarnated or as a returned human from the Brahma realm, you would believe that, this is the creator God. So we have to somehow worship them and get to their level eventually in order to find everlasting happiness. But so the Brahma reached this conclusion through his own logic, of course. However, Buddhist thought maintains a certain skepticism toward pure reasoning and deduction, because logic can still lead you to false conclusions. The sphere of logic itself is only in the astral plane anyway. Logical thinking, reasoning, that's all mental plane. It's in the first level of the causal world where that happens, or the higher mental world. It can be delusional. It can be endless. It doesn't necessarily make sense. So your starting premises might be flawed if you're thinking about things all the time. Even if you're a God thinking, you have to think in the right way. And this requires wisdom. Now, the entire path of Western philosophy and even modern science reflects this pattern. That's no surprise that science would. We constantly adopt very erroneous theories based on, speculative foundations. Scientists, once hypothesized that a specific substance filled the vacuum for light to move through. And so physicists operated under the assumption that this medium was present, but eventually they realized that this material was non-existent and unnecessary. And at that specific era, the theory seemed to make sense. It was a deduction basis with the available data. There's a story concerning the French Academy and their estimates of the sun's duration. They modeled their math on the concept that the sun was a massive block of, coal on fire. And their arithmetic was likely sound if the sun were actually made of fuel, but they simply had no knowledge of a heat source more powerful than a fire pit. So their final measurements were off by astronomical numerical factors. And this created a rift between earth scientists and physicists during the 1800s. The astronomers insisted that the cosmos was only a few 100,000 years old. Meanwhile, the geologists argued that ancient stones, not the cosmos, but I think the Earth is what they mean here. But the ancient stones were hundreds of millions of years old. In this example, it's either stones from Earth itself or stones that had fallen onto Earth that had blasted through the atmosphere as asteroids. So this theme appears in Buddhism to show how you can be drastically mistaken when you just think about things without knowing through the Akash, without inquiring the Akash. And science takes pride in the fact that it can acknowledge these errors and fix them. And that's a fine quality, but it provides little solace when you are oblivious to your own blunders. because it's a risky ground. It's risky to ground vital life choices on inaccurate data, right? Now, self-correction is a noble ideal for a scientist to have, to maintain, but our time is fleeting and we have to make critical spiritual decisions too. We can't rely on purely mathematical or scientific means when we really just don't understand how things work yet, or if there isn't enough information. We can't rely on the faculties of inference. And there's an account of the Buddha traveling to visit a Brahma named Baka, and the Buddha possessed a complete memory of every previous incarnation. He's a Buddha. He has that memory awakened. So he shared a profound history with this specific Baka, and they were both mortals many ages ago. And the Buddha had actually served as a pupil to this Brahma during a human life. So that teacher was a very powerful mystic back then. He used his meditative skill to secure a higher rebirth. So he perfected the fourth jhana, Samadhi, and rose to the peak of the Brahma Heavens. And as enormous epochs passed by, he descended from that height. He eventually landed in the primary Brahma realm, or Brahma level. He was the very first to manifest in that cycle, as I mentioned before. And the Buddha realized his old friend had trapped himself in a fantasy, so he traveled to that dimension to rectify his perspective. So in the legend, it contains several humorous moments, because when the Buddha arrives, the students of the Brahma are influenced by a dark force, and they immediately confront the Buddha. They demand that the monk prostrate himself before the great master, and they warn him that if he doesn't, he'll be reborn as a measly dwarf as penalty for his pride. So they say, you are instructed to offer reverence to this master, Baka. And so Baka then proceeds to recite his own grand titles. He declares himself the Great Brahma. He claims the roles of supreme ruler and progenitor. He asserts that he is the champion of all things. So it resembles a performance by a powerful illusionist who warns you to not peek behind the stage screen. And so the Buddha remains unmoved by this display. He informs the Brahma that he is not actually the peak of the cosmos. So he informs him that there are several tiers above his region that remain unknown to him. Now, at first, the Brahma is skeptical, and so they have a bit of a dispute, they have a debate. But Baka eventually, he decides to, how do I say, to challenge the Buddha, to test his level of power and ability, to see who has greater abilities and perception. So Baka claims that he can vanish from view while the Buddha can't hide from him. The Buddha wouldn't be able to do the same as great as the Brahma. What he does is, but naturally the Brahma fails to escape the Buddha's gaze, right? So first, he successfully departs from the Buddha's vision by ascending to the second jhana, which does not impress the Buddha at all. So in this realm, the Baka can't even conceive. He can't even conceive of this himself. He just disappears into it, I guess. The traditional analysis of the scripture provides more specifics on the Brahma's failed attempt to vanish. First, he returns to his transparent essence instead of a solid form that a person could perceive. But the Buddha could still track him. And I think this is part of just disappearing into the second jhana. And so, of course, the Buddha is beyond all of the jhanas. To be a Buddha, you have to have Samadhi. You have to master Samadhi and live there. You would live there naturally. So the Buddha found him there. You could still see him. Next, he generated a massive cloud of darkness. Just this all-encompassing, I guess, blackness or emptiness. But the Buddha, he radiated it with light. He just countered it with its opposite. So then, as a final resort, in frustration, the Brahma, he found a tree and he crouched behind it. And at that point, his own disciples, they made fun of him, saying, "Is that you, great Brahma, hiding behind the tree?" So this story highlights the hierarchy of understanding. Superior grades of wisdom are simply inaccessible until that specific field is unlocked psychologically. So we master basic arithmetic, but remain ignorant of multiplication. And it goes on from there. Maybe we learn how to multiply, but we have no grasp of equations or geometry. We remain unaware of more advanced calculations and perceptions, the complex and sophisticated ways our system functions. So these higher insights are just veiled from us. It's beyond our development. We have to develop it ourselves. And on the contrary, the more basic facts are plain to anyone possessing advanced expertise. So this pattern repeats throughout the timeline of human discovery. You have the example of Lord Kelvin, who lent his name to the absolute thermal scale. And he was the leading authority on the maturity of the globe. He calculated that the world was roughly 20 million years old, and this occurred in the 20th century. But then researchers began to observe the mechanics of atomic breakdown. They realized that the planet was likely between 2 and 3 billion years old. And there was a junior researcher who had to present this at a major meeting. And Kelvin was 90 years old then and occupied the front row as the most respected scholar. And this 25-year-old had to stand up and announce the new multi-billion year estimate. The old master sat there with probably a grin as if he was pitying the foolishness of the newcomer. But the scale of time has shifted by massive powers of 10. Powers of the 10 instantly. And you can find that, it wasn't long ago when the most accurate modern calculations for the Earth's age was estimated. This happened around 2005, where we rediscovered that actually it's approximately 4.38 billion years old. But it's that recent that we discovered this. And so, it just shows us how much we really don't know. Scientists required lunar samples to finally confirm that specific number. Yeah, so we've only narrowed it down to that precision in the last few decades, couple of decades or so. These are examples of ignorance and limited awareness. So the Buddha is attempting to educate his culture about a much more vast reality, and this is the universe contained within the mind itself. And I should mention that the connection regarding how these Brahmas actually come to existence, on an individual scale, the doorway to the Brahma sphere is jhana. So a person who masters jhana might take birth within the Brahma domain. But on a global scale, it presents a plane of life situated above the world of the senses. So when universes vanish and new ones form, the Brahma realms are the final ones to disappear, and they're also the first ones to emerge. So there's a highly intricate cycle at play. The world can be demolished by... And now, the way these evolve and devolve and disappear or get destroyed in the pralaya is by three elements. It's either by heat or water or air. And I'm not sure why earth is missing from this, or ether, or electromagnetic energy. But the destruction by heat wipes out everything up to the first Brahma. This occurs 15 times. And on the 16th occasion, the devastation comes from water. And this washes away everything, reaching the second jhana. And then, so there are 15 of those sequences involving both heat and water. And then on the 64th instance, a gale of air levels everything out in the third jhana. One ancient manuscript creates a clear link between these elements and the meditative states, because it explains that heat is like active thought. So thinking stops the first jhana level, and it's the last point where mental construction exists. Now, water is compared to rapture. The joy of water extends to the second, or joy extends to the second jhana, where it finally ends. Air is like breath. So this is why breathing becomes the third thorn, or the thorn of the third jhana. It's said to halt entirely. It stops entirely. Breathing is said to stop entirely in the fourth jhana. In order for that jhana to happen, for samadhi to happen. So it's quite brilliant. So these accounts are quite marvelous because of how they harmonize these details. They don't simply appear by chance. They're not created by a god or born from a vacuum. They're populated by inhabitants who were reborn there. And most often they arrive from the human world after achieving jhana, or mastering it. And this establishes a very specific and logical connection between these dimensions and human awareness. The first jhana tier is the only one where we find personal names and legends. We have various accounts of figures like Brahma Sahampati visiting the Buddha to request that he shares his wisdom. And these are all first level, first jhana Brahmas, because active thought only exists up to that level. We don't categorize the residents of the second or the third or fourth tiers as individuals anymore. So there aren't any stories of them taking action because they're just constantly consumed and engulfed by joy. And in fact, no discursive movement happens there. They exist in a state of still ecstasy, more or less. I can't remember if there were analogies on this, but if we look into the realm of non-perception, this is a really strange band of the universe, a bandwidth, because in the cosmic maps, it's grouped with the fourth jhana beings, but yet it's not truly fourth jhana, it's not truly samadhi. It's reserved for practitioners who decide that awareness and perception are the roots of all agony. So they don't want to have any existence at all. That's how you get here. They believe those factors must be removed, awareness and perception. So they develop a sort of mental numbing agent in their practice. They're reborn into a world where they look like stunning statues resting in their seats. And it's just amazing because there's this wisdom of thinking that the agony and suffering is caused by existence, so you shouldn't have even the slightest awareness or perception at all, right? And that's so they look like statues that are consumed in bliss. And they rest for hundreds of cosmic cycles without even a single flash of awareness. And yet the very moment a thought occurs, they vanish from that realm and reappear in a lower dimension. And from our perspective, this doesn't look really helpful or beneficial at all, because, in fact, maybe I'm describing it incorrectly by saying that they're consumed in bliss if they don't have, I don't think so actually, because they don't have perception or awareness. You could say that it looks like they existed for, staggering lengths of time, eternities, and yet they have no experience of it. So the final instant of their old life and the first instant of their new life are adjacent, right? It's like going under full anesthesia for a surgery. And this is analyzed in the ancient commentaries. It provides a very fascinating look at the essence of time and the nature of the mind, because it describes how under normal conditions or circumstances, every instance of awareness acts as the direct trigger for the following one. And you can visualize this like a line of toppling tiles or dominoes. One moment of thought arises and the next one follows immediately. But we must ask how a sequence of awareness can persist with a gap of, 500 cosmic cycles, or I guess they're talking about kalpas or Maha Manvantaras, or great cosmic days. So the teaching suggests that the duration of the pause is irrelevant because the chain remains intact. And it implies that while a timeline exists in the external cosmos, and there's somehow a timeline in the mind, they are usually in sync. And is it possible for the mental sequence to bridge an external void? Because it's kind of like, I don't know if this makes sense here, but it's getting very obscure. But if you look at the analogy of a hunter, I think in some of these suttas, the hunter tracking down a deer through a forest, he trails the prints on the ground that are left by until he reaches a wide stretch of solid stone, and the marks vanish. And then he traverses that rock layer and discovers the prints, these hoof prints, resuming on the far side. And so even though the signs, disappeared on one end, and returned on the other, he doesn't assume that the stag ceases to exist in between. He assumes, well, the deer must have kept walking, and there were no footprints left behind, and on the other side, they continued, of course, because it's a rock, right? But so these are the kinds of interesting analogies that we see in Oriental stories, because what they're saying is, well, actually, they're always addressing, are you sure that there's no non-existence when you don't perceive something like that? So if you don't see these hoof prints, maybe it's the case that actually the deer disappeared for some time and reappeared on the other side, went somewhere else, like a parallel. Like these are suggesting parallel universes. It's like, right? That's what some of these koans mean. Sound of, or like the sound of a tree falling in a forest, right? Does it really make a sound if there's no one there to hear it? And according to parallel universes, maybe it doesn't make a sound because if you don't hear it, there's probably no tree falling. So the scriptures have graceful and refined comparisons for these concepts. So a modern equivalent, as I was going to get at, would be going under with the anesthesia, going fully under anesthesia, and that sedation happens immediately, and you enter a state of, it's not even a proper sleep, I guess. You don't get a proper sleep. You don't always dream. You just immediately wake up, and from what some people claim, you don't even remember a sense of time going by. Apparently, it's not like deep sleep or any kind of sleep where typical sleep where you have a nap or something and you wake up and you have a sense of how much time has gone by. But apparently with surgeries, like with anesthesia or sedation, you often don't. And so you don't recognize that you received the breathing mask, you count to 10 or something, and then suddenly you wake up and you're back here or in a different ward. So it's like that. And you find yourself asking when the procedure would begin, only to find that it's already finished, right? Now, are there other Brahma realms or regions that continue on past these 4 levels? There is more to this. There are the elevated Brahma levels, and if you study the specifics, it's very useful for those who want to master meditation. We noted that verbal thought and intellectual thought is absent after the first level, the first jhana. It's said that the most magnificent sight in existence is a great Brahma resting in his tower. And the second level, the second jhana, matches the second meditative state. It's claimed to be the most exquisite sound in the universe that resides here, because these Brahmas are constantly exclaiming their delight. They're just overwhelmed by sheer joy and rapture. And so they call out, I think they call out, they say, oh, the bliss, oh, the joy, oh, the bliss. And you just hear them calling out like this, I guess, moaning and out of rapture. And so the inner glow that they radiate, the kind of their vibration, right? I don't know how you would be able to imagine this really, but they have this radiance to them. Their pulse, their glow. It wavers like the flame it wavers and flickers like the flame of of a candle or of a torch, or what is it called, like of a lantern. So there's a lot of movement to the rapture. Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be able to visualize what emotion. You'd have to understand what emotion looks like. There's movement to it. You can feel it. But the third jhana resonates at the peak of universal contentment. It's equanimity. And this is a silent realm because they feel so pure and happy, but without the agitation of excitement. So it's very similar to the previous one, but everybody's quiet. And it's even more tranquil, and it's a more vast experience. So their light is, yeah, I guess they do have a luminosity to them. So their emotions are visible. You can see that and their overall frequency is radiating in their aura, basically. So their light is constant and unwavering, like the glow of the moon. It doesn't pulse like a flame. And finally, the fourth level is the realm of grand results, where complete equanimity is the fundamental frequency. And so these Brahmas dwell in a state of profound stillness. And their territory isn't demolished when the cosmos ends either. So later writings address whether this contradicts the law that nothing lasts forever. So they conclude that it does not. It's not a physical location. Each individual being here exists as their own independent state. And in these lower tiers, there's a visible architecture, like a floor of gems and specific dwellings. However, the beings in Samadhi here, the fourth jhana, they exist in a different mode altogether. Each person exists in a state of isolated peace. So the outlines of the form become indistinct. There is no genuine perception of a physical body or a location for a person to occupy. And this reflects our earlier talk about the world of the senses becoming more refined until you enter into the non-sensual, the formless Brahma realms. So in the same way, the physical shape becomes more delicate in these Brahma spheres. Now, beyond the fourth stage, beyond the Samadhi meditation lies this formlessness. Okay, so in the formless Samadhi, the subtle Samadhi, there still is some form, but it's just extremely vague. But beyond that, the beings don't possess any bodies whatsoever. They consist entirely of mind. So you can only observe a magnificent organization and balance here. The thought processes used to map this gradual rise are exceptionally elegant. It's a steady climb from worldly pleasures toward a very refined and deep serenity, or rather a deep joy. And then you move into the Rupa jhanas. And as the Brahma worlds unfold, the body continues to become more subtle, and it continues to vanish. The quality of the mind shifts from delight and rapture to equanimity, and then finally to complete and profound stillness or balance before it leaves the scale of form, the realm of form entirely, to meet the arupa levels. And for the sake of a complete visualization, complete description, we should also identify the Suddhavasas, or the Pure Lands. These are the pristine dwellings reserved for the non-returners. This region is technically grouped with the 4th jhana level, and it represents the very apex of physical life. The highest point is known as Akinata, which acts as the ceiling of the cosmos. A non-returner is a person who has reached the 3rd stage of enlightenment. They've conquered the more basic attachments, but still hold a faint yearning for existence. And since they have uprooted the source of worldly cravings, it's impossible for them to return to the sensory world. They don't have to. And there is no remaining energy to pull them back there, but they possess the will to exist. So they have to manifest somewhere. They must relocate somewhere. So they occupy these 5 specialized levels of purity, and they live in a condition of extreme subtlety and serenity until they attain full liberation and completely cessate the cycle of rebirth. It's been a remarkable journey through the cosmos. So this serves as my comprehensive summary of these very vast mental regions and their appearances and frequencies in nature. The descriptions found in the Buddhist scriptures and the later analyses are truly incredible. You can really respect the depth of study and the clear expression that details such a grand system.